Hello, and welcome back to High Score. In this video, I'll be describing what makes video game music so different to music found in similar media, such as film scores or TV soundtracks. Before we start, however, I'd like to take a moment to shout out the amazing artists who have contributed to this series. Ava Antonia created the logo, which you'll see pretty much everywhere on Twitch and YouTube. Elsa Smith is responsible for the start and end cards seen before and after each video. Finally, my good buddy Coco has created a unique thumbnail for each YouTube video. I'm eternally grateful to these folks for contributing to this series, and you can find them at the channel shown on screen. Now, let's get started. Interactive media. Before we consider how music must be altered to suit a new medium, it might be wise to first nail down exactly what makes a game, and not just a collection of scenes and dialogue, which could be mistaken for a movie. Ludologist and video game theorist Jesper Juul gave a keynote speech to the Level Up conference in 2003. He says a video game can be defined as a rule-based system with a variable and quantifiable outcome. Where different outcomes are assigned different values, the player exerts effort in order to influence the outcome. The player feels emotionally attached to the outcome, and the consequences of the activity are negotiable. For the sake of this series, we can simplify this a little. A video game is any medium which gives the consumer choices with variable outcomes. These outcomes can often have an emotional impact on the player, both positive and negative. This statement gives us a broad idea of why music is used in video games, and what form it takes in this media. Why? To develop and further enhance the player's emotional investment in the game, the latter part of Juul's definition. For example, take this scene from The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Having defeated the final boss, Link must bid farewell to this adventure's companion, Fi. Fi is a spirit who resides in Link's blade and offers robot-like advice, such as estimating a 30% chance of survival, or informing the player that their controller batteries are running low. The character acts as a companion and friend to the player as they develop their skills throughout the game. As such, this scene has great emotional impact. First, watch the cutscene with music I've added myself. If you're familiar with the scene, I can only apologise. We'll return to talk about musical contrast later, but for now, watch the rest of the scene with the original soundtrack. Think about what it adds to the context and what additional emotions you feel because of it.
なりまだスローが多い。急がせがびしょ。
Much more emotional, right? The style and composition of the music is emotional on its own, but paired with the context of the cutscene, as well as a slower, softer version of Thief's theme, it takes on a whole new level of meaning. The why video game music is composed the way it is perhaps easier to understand. All music creates emotion and is itself a product of the composer's feelings, a concept we'll come back to next week. Tying it to real characters and environments will naturally lead to a heightened impact. The other part of the question, what form it takes, is a little more complex. Of course, we know some of the technicalities behind its creation. Last week I described how branching path algorithms and transformation matrices are used to create dynamic soundtracks that can change in real time. But why are they required? The answer, once again, can be found in Joule's definition of a video game: interactivity. In order to be considered a game, it must offer the player choices. Naturally, these choices will result in various outcomes, and so each outcome must provide a unique musical response. Video games are inherently interactive, and so their soundtracks must be composed to adapt to this. Cutscenes provide a prime example of the differences between linear and non-linear experiences. A movie scene will have a set duration and audio track, which will always be identical, no matter how many people watch the scene or how many times it is repeated. In video games, however, players may take different amounts of time to process the dialogue. They may enter the cutscene with varying objectives or carrying emotional weight from previous experiences. They can take time to consider the dialogue or choose to skip over it entirely. As such, cutscenes will never play the same way twice. Game soundtracks must be designed in such a way that they suit the player's experience, regardless of how they interact with the game. Player-dependent progression. Interactivity is, at the most basic level, a player-driven action. Movies will carry on in the same direction regardless of your interaction. Games present multiple options to players, each resulting in a unique outcome. In presenting these options to the player, the game hands over control, allowing them to make decisions. This aspect of control is unique to video games. Karen Collins compares the interactivity of game soundtracks to an underground subway system. The music of non-linear media like video games, however, works more like a major urban metro. At any time, we may want to be able to hop off at one station and hop onto another train going in a new direction. We may not get on at the end of this new train, but perhaps on one of the middle cars. The train may choose to speed up at night or slow down through built-up urban areas. Every audio cue, train car, must be designed to stand alone, since there is no way to predict its hundreds of possible directions. There is no correct sequence of events for the train to follow. This control can manifest both consciously and unconsciously. In choosing to travel to a new area, the player is consciously changing the soundtrack. If a player wants to hear a particular area or character theme, they are free to travel to the location which would allow them to do so. In many cases, games allow players to fast travel to various locations, allowing them to immediately change the soundtrack's progression. Initiating combat is another example of the player making a conscious decision which changes the soundtrack's progression. In some games, the soundtrack changes based on time progression. This can take the form of a level timer, such as in Mario titles, or the time of day, a key feature in the Animal Crossing series. The player has no direct control over the passage of time, however their presence is often required for it to occur. This is an example of unconscious soundtrack progression. By spending time in a location or level, time passes and the soundtrack changes. In Animal Crossing, players create their own character in a remote village or island and spend time completing tasks, catching fish and bugs, and socialising with their animal villagers. The game has no overarching story or objective. Think of it like Nintendo's take on The Sims. The game operates on a real-time basis, so 8 AM in the player's time zone will also appear as 8 AM in their virtual community. Each hour has its own unique track, which changes once the hour has passed. Here's an example from the latest game in the series, Animal Crossing New Horizons. You'll hear the 4 PM track play, a short interlude to signal the hour, before the 5 PM track begins. Of course, if the player wasn't playing, then they wouldn't be present to hear this change, so they are still required for the progression, but specific inputs are not. It's also possible for a player to unconsciously initiate combat or a battle sequence. In doing so, the combat music will begin without the player's intent, thus being an unconscious trigger. Unconscious soundtrack triggers blend into the larger game experience. The control given to the player isn't specifically recognised. Instead, it just becomes part of a larger experience. In a chapter of Emotion in Video Game Soundtracking, Giles Hooper, a lecturer in musicology at the University of Liverpool, says, "It works precisely by virtue of the viewer-player not being aware of how it is working." In this sense, the true value of the soundtrack is enhanced when the player doesn't notice its presence. Crossfade to black. The use of transitions is also different within a video game context. Film soundtracks will always move between the same two tracks after the same length of time and at the same point in each track. We already know that this sort of approach won't work in a non-linear environment, as any player interaction, deliberate or otherwise, could trigger a new track or sound. Obviously, composers can't create material for every single possible transition. Instead, transition engines are used. These use a set of rules and structures to transition between tracks in real time. These transitions can take many different forms depending on the structure of the game. Loading screens usually use silence to transition between tracks, like in the Splatoon series, which uses a silent loading screen to transition between the lobby and the battle opening cinematic. In other cases, games might simply fade between tracks. This can be useful for transitions which don't feature a cutscene, but can be difficult to implement effectively, especially in situations where 3 or more tracks may be baying for dominance. It can also result in fault lines, occasions where players find the exact spot in which one track transitions to another. In these cases, players can hop back and forth, causing both tracks to trigger simultaneously. Another example of an interactive transition is the use of a jingle or other sound effect to connect two tracks. This is used a lot in the Mario Kart series. As the player enters their final lap, a jingle plays before the faster version of the track's music begins. Sonic feedback. No, unfortunately this isn't the reveal of the next 3D Sonic the Hedgehog game. I'm using this phrase to describe the use of video game audio to guide and aid the player in making decisions. As mentioned all the way through this video, the interactivity of video games is unique to the medium and, as such, this use of audio can also only be found here. How it manifests itself can vary. A simple example is the use of jingles and other sound effects to immediately feedback on the player's performance. Perhaps the most famous of these is the death jingle from Super Mario Bros., which sounds immediately on the player's death. Once the player learns this sound, they will recognise their failure immediately on any future deaths. Obviously this can apply to more positive situations too, such as power-ups or level clears. Sound effects are also useful in guiding players through 3D environments. In situations where no obvious objective or progression can be seen, a sound effect can be used to lure the player towards a nearby enemy or to a ship which they must board. These are broad examples, but you get the idea. In some cases, audio can be used to alert the player to the changing world around them. A change to a more combative track can indicate the presence of enemies to the player, even if they can't identify them visually. Subtle changes to music can also be used to inform the player of progress in a particular puzzle or dungeon. These can also take place in a much more immediate time frame. Let's go back to the Splatoon series. Players using blaster weapons can deal damage against an opponent by shooting near them, known as an indirect, or even greater damage by shooting right at them, known as a direct. These shots give off different sound effects, informing the player of how much damage they have dealt to their opponent, which will, in turn, allow them to better plan their next action. Sonic feedback can also take a much more passive approach. Returning to the Animal Crossing series, each of the hourly tracks also has a rain and snow variation, which plays when the weather changes. This has nothing to do with player input, but still provides a more immersive and believable environment for the player to explore. Some games incorporate music into their central mechanics. We'll discuss Ocarina of Time in much more depth later in the series, but it's a prime example of this. The Ocarina is used to progress the story, enhance the world of Hyrule, allow the player to progress side quests, and build a relationship between them and their avatar. Without this mechanic, each of these areas would be much less developed. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention to one particular genre of game that perhaps makes the most use of sonic feedback: rhythm games. These titles rely on player input and time to background music, sometimes along with matching visuals. Some games alter the flow or instrumentation of the track according to the player's performance, giving an immediate sense of feedback. Conclusion. While some musical properties are shared between video game soundtracks and soundtracks of other media, many key aspects are unique. Video game music plays a central role in immersing the player and heightening their emotional investment in the decisions they must take. By their very nature, games present choices to the player, each with unique outcomes. The decisions made by player inputs can be both conscious and unconscious. The soundtrack must be able to adapt to these outcomes and do so in a way which does not break immersion. Another challenge presented by video game soundtracks is that of transitions. The non-linear, player-driven progression of the game means the soundtrack may have to shift between multiple tracks at any given time. Transition engines are used to create meaningful, non-intrusive transitions based on game properties and genre. Some games use audio and sound to aid players in making their decisions. Sound effects and jingles can be used to signal success or failure to the player, while changes in music tracks can alert the player to nearby danger. Some games use music to actively guide the player, while others make use of a more passive feedback system. In some genres, games make music a key mechanic, testing how accurately the player can keep time. Rhythm games host a large variety of musical genres and base their entire feedback system around immediate musical response. In other genres, The player's use of virtual instruments can progress storylines, alter their environment, and enhance their connection to the game's avatar. This in itself presents a whole new range of topics to consider, which I'll return to in the case study on Ocarina of Time. Here are the references and music credits I've used to make this video. If anything you find here doesn't answer a question, or you have anything extra you want to add about what I've considered in this video, feel free to contact me in any of these locations and I'll do my best to help. Now we can get to the good stuff. Next week, I'll be talking about how music can help build worlds around the player and be used to create particular atmospheres. I'll also discuss how it can deepen the relationship between the player and their avatar, and how the use of cutscenes isn't as simple or as straightforward as you might think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.